Alrighty, we have a very special guest today, Alex from FTR Politics. Very excited to be able to speak to him about what he's doing in order to get engagement in Georgia. We have my friend Chase, as always, joining from the car this time around. Want to thank him for taking a little bit of time off from work. But Alex, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Um, if you want me to just go ahead and get right into what we're doing here at FTR, I'd love to go ahead and talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. How did it begin? What are you doing now? What is it
Right.
like?
So my name is Alex Van. I'm one half of FTR Political Strategies. We're based out of Roswell, Georgia. I'm 28. I have been doing paid political work since around 2016, 2017. And my spouse and I run this business. We have been running campaigns on all kinds of levels since, like I said, around 2017, 2018. But this business has been on the paper, our full-time endeavor since 2023. We've done races basically below the statewide level. So U.S. House, State Senate, State House, City Council, Mayor, County Commission, Clerk of Court, Sheriff, District Attorney, kind of all these little, not even little, some of them are pretty major offices. All the parts of government that are kind of making our everyday lives work. And we kind of run the gamut in terms of everything we do. We do a lot of stuff in-house between the two of us, but as a campaign grows, we'll often kind of take on kind of like the C-suite type roles of managing the volunteers and other staff members under it. We do campaigns that running budgets like school board races that are running ten to $20,000 budgets, but we're also doing campaigns that are running six-figure budgets. So we work in Georgia, and we've worked across the entire state with campaigns as well as organizations like PACs.
So, what got you involved? What got you engaged? Why did you start FTR in the first place?
So I graduated high school in 2015, and I wanted to do political journalism. And I went to UGA and I worked for the Red and Black, which is the student newspaper at UGA.
Mhm.
And some of the first stories I covered at UGA was I attended the first ever Donald Trump event in Georgia at the Georgia World Congress Center live from the scene. And I covered the RNC in 2016 live in Cleveland. Um, and I'd grown up in a pretty from a pretty conservative background, but I had already become pretty uncomfortable with what I thought the Republican Party stood for. And those experiences as a journalist only really kind of drove that home.
Yeah.
And then I looked around and I saw that there were so many Democratic campaigns that I thought were just making terrible strategic decisions or being very wasteful with their resources. And I realized that I thought that I could use my transferable skills to help out. So my first paid job was working in the Atlanta mayoral race in 2017. And then we did a bunch of races in Athens. We ran our first races in 2020. We defeated the incumbent sheriff in Athens, and we also ran a couple other races. And that experience in particular, primarying a five-term incumbent sheriff with like a grassroots insurgent candidate who stood for progressive values, winning that, I think kind of solidified for me this is something I wanted to do. Um, After college, with the pandemic and everything, we kind of had to take a step back. So we both worked in the private sector for a couple years. And then in 2023, we kind of felt like it was our time. We started what we thought was going to be a side hustle enterprise, basically.
Mhm.
But very quickly, we realized that it was actually a better income and we actually loved the work more than doing our regular jobs. So Mo and I both quit our jobs, and then we ended up, doing FTR in mid 2023. And then, since then we've been growing, very gratefully because of our reputation for doing good work and being honest. Um, so, that's kind of how I ended up here today. And, today we're doing races for the 2025 municipal cycle. We're doing races in 2026 already, people planning and getting ready for major seats are going to be competing against. And like I said earlier, we're also now moving into working with groups that have longer term visions and goals even beyond next year, right? Like they are an organization, they're more than a candidate, and they're already thinking about, what are we trying to do to turn Georgia blue in 4 years or 6 years or 10 years? So that's really exciting to now kind of have this proof of work to show that we can make a living out of this. in an incredibly long-term sense. And that's kind of where we're at today.
That's awesome. I do want to get into the future races, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about what happened in the 2024 presidential election. Did you? I don't know if you saw this in Georgia, but did you get a sense that things were starting to kind of shift tides towards Trump, or do you? Was this were you kind of blindsided? Because for me, from what I saw personally, I mean, I knew it was going to be a 50-50 toss up, but like I wasn't expecting the blowout that it was in terms of the electoral college. I mean, every swing state ended up going to Donald Trump and pretty comfortably. So, did you have a sense that we were going to have the shift that we did, or were you blindsided?
I didn't feel blindsided. We were canvassing very aggressively for a few of our candidates. Like, for example, in a state senate race, we had ended up knocking and lip dropping and also like phone banking literally like 20,000 people, right?
Wow.
And that was in a really purple area of Georgia. It was like East Cobb, Roswell, and
Yeah.
Woodstock, which is like peak, that's kind of a battleground part of Georgia. East
Yeah.
Cobb and Roswell are, perennially that red to kind of purple area.
Yeah.
And then Woodstock is red, but it's also rapidly diversifying and rapidly becoming younger because of all the affordable housing.
Yeah.
So, like, if you're going to try to get a gut check of where Georgia's going, that's a pretty good area to look at. And one thing that I noticed, especially in retrospect, looking at what happened, was that we are really kind of struggling to justify what our economic message was. Um, and we were not getting a lot of direction from, the coordinated campaign in the top of the ticket about how to talk about some of these issues.
Yeah.
We really kind of felt like we had good messages when it came to gun safety, when it came to like pro-choice issues. Um, but in retrospect, I think that we had a lot of concerns about where the economy was and how that was landing, especially with Biden being the incumbent.
Yeah.
So I was a little surprised that things went the way that they did on election night, but especially when I kind of put all the pieces together, at the time I hadn't really taken them because we were so busy. I hadn't really like put it all together, but especially looking back on it when I had to kind of confront that, I realized I saw a lot more warning signs that I maybe didn't interpret in the right way at the time.
Yeah.
So I'll say I was kind of surprised, but not shocked.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that what was difficult for me to kind of comprehend initially when it happened was, I mean, if you look at our economic numbers in terms of like inflation and employment compared to our counterparts with like the G7 and G20 countries, like we outperformed all of them. And so, like, my mindset was like, the economy is doing well, but the issue was Biden was not a great messenger at that. I mean, reality is that he was a little older. We all know that. But I figured Kamala Harris would be able to kind of message that a lot better because Trump never gives numbers. He never gives like any detailed layout of anything. It's like even when it during the debate with Kamala Harris, he said he had he had concepts of a plan for healthcare. So like, for me, it almost seemed like, okay, well, Kamala is now in the driver's seat. There seemed to be a lot of excitement around her, but I mean, it turned out to be a lot more noise than anything else. But I think that the reality is like I was expecting a lot more. I was expecting to at least get one or two swing states, and that was another thing that I wanted to ask you about. Do you think that Waltz was the best option for VP, or do you think she should have been more strategic in who she picked as VP and going with a swing state like a Josh Shapiro?
I don't think the vice president selections matter very much. There's a lot of, my background is journalism, but also I have a political science degree.
Yeah.
And they've done a lot of research into seeing what the effect is of having a vice president from a given state.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing, especially, is like back 100 years ago or more, when it was not easy to get political name ID because there
Mm-hmm.
was not really like mass media environment like there is now. Having a vice president from a particular state did matter quite a bit,
Mm-hmm.
but especially in the modern era where every voter can feasibly get information about all the candidates available, there's like a very small bonus. And in particular is actually more notable in states that have small populations.
Yeah.
Like for example, Palin and Biden in 2008, there was a really significant vice president home state advantage because Alaska and Delaware both have such small populations.
Right.
Um, but what they found is that especially when you have a vice president from a really large state like Waltz or Shapiro, or JD Vance, like at best, you're getting like 1 point, maybe. And like even in the statistic, like the soundness of that is not even that great.
Yeah.
And the reality is that also that, we lost Pennsylvania by more than that. Um, and I thought Waltz was a great communicator. I don't think there would have been much of a difference on the outcome. I think that what happened was kind of a sequence of a lot of really bad outcomes and bad decisions.
Mhm.
And I think the root of it all would have been that if Biden had not run for reelection at all, and if Harris had just been able to start fresh from the beginning, that would have been the best point to change what happened. I don't think that she bears any responsibility for that. I think she actually bailed out our ticket, especially looking at about how poorly Biden was doing prior to that point.
Mhm.
Um, I don't think that changing the vice presidential nominee would have changed the outcome. Um, I think that there had to have been other choices that were made further back on the stream,
Yeah.
to talk about what would have changed things.
Yeah, I do have a question on that. I think that it seems like there's something happening literally every week with Donald Trump, whether it be like the crash in DC that he blamed on DEI, or the Hegseth signal gate, or the tariffs and Liberation Day. I mean, it's been something literally every single week, and Donald Trump hasn't even been in office for over 100 days yet, which is just baffling to me because it feels like he's already been here for years. Um,
Yeah, it's crazy.
yeah, I know. And I do want to talk about, I definitely want to talk about that. But I mean, to get back to the retro, do you think that if Biden was a little younger and a little bit better at messaging, or at least was more coherent than he was? Because like I think the reality is like Biden, I think he struggled, but I personally believe that he was still, for the most part, an effective leader because he still managed to get the infrastructure bill passed. He still managed to get the CHIPS Act passed. And those were things that we saw, actionable change here in Georgia too. And we saw actual benefits from especially the infrastructure bill. Do you think that if Biden was a little younger or at least a little more coherent with, his speech, that we would have seen a reelection and he would have won the incumbency? Or do you think Donald Trump he had like that momentum going in?
I think that communication was a huge issue with the Biden administration.
Yeah.
And that's on two fronts. From the standpoint of him and his personal communication issues is definitely a barrier. But the Biden administration, I think as a whole, was not good at effectively communicating what they were doing and what the benefits were. And a lot of times they took the approach that instead of wanting to explain what was going on, they would browbeat people for not really understanding or for doubting the results.
Yeah.
And as good as the infrastructure bill was, or as the CHIPS Act was, I will push back a little bit on your premises that we saw benefits of that. I think that there's a much larger discussion to be had about how long it takes for federal policy to be enacted
Yeah.
because of the bureaucratic systems we're trying to follow, because of the different like local barriers to like building things, and different things like that. I think that one of the biggest problems is that almost everything in the infrastructure bill, only like a very small drop of it was actually enacted during Biden's presidency. So
Yeah.
people saw the news about these massive, you know, prices attached to these bills, and then they weren't seeing results. And now the problem is that we're going to see a lot of that finally get through the process and unfold properly in like the next 3 to 4 years, and people are going to think that Trump did that.
Yeah.
And the problem is that, especially when it comes to construction projects, especially when it comes to infrastructure projects,
Yeah.
with the way that we build things in the United States compared to other countries and how long it takes and how expensive our projects are, people just weren't seeing the benefit of that. And I don't necessarily blame them for that, because there are so many projects in those bills that are still in like not even the turnkey phase, not even in like the starting to build things phase. And I think that it's a shame that they weren't able to get that stuff off sooner, because, going back to Shapiro, I mean, Shapiro, when that bridge collapsed in Philadelphia, that was a great example of what you can do when you throw away a lot of these different kind of barriers and administrative issues. I mean, he got that bridge rebuilt in just a shockingly short amount of time.
Yeah.
And I think people want to see their tax dollars and the different things that they need being taken with drastic action. So I think that if we had the type of recovery that we saw, in the Great Depression with some of the different programs that FDR was doing, or again, some of these smaller scale examples like Shapiro and the bridge, that we would have seen higher approval because we'd actually see the fruit of these things being done.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's a good point. I mean, in referencing the infrastructure bill, I read something a little while back that Georgia had gotten approval to start researching an area for high speed rail from here to North Carolina, and a large part of that grant came from the infrastructure bill. So like, that's in terms of like actually getting stuff done and like getting it starting to getting it built out. I know we aren't seeing any of those benefits coming right now, but there has been research into actually like looking to see if it's feasible and how we can go upon doing that. But you're right. You know, we're not going to actually start seeing like the real benefits of that until the next couple of years, in which Donald Trump is, I'm sure, going to get a lot of attention for. But I want to now start looking forward to well, I mean, the next couple races, including the midterms. Who do you think right now is the leader for the Democratic Party? Do you think it's the AOCs? Do you think it's the Bernie Sanders? Or do you think that it's someone else, the traditional Democrats? Is it the Kamala Harris's? Is it the Pete Buttigieg's? Who do you think right now best represents the Democratic Party and best is able to actually like push us forward?
That's a great question, and I don't think that there's a good answer. I don't think that there is a leader right now, and I think in the media environment and that we're seeing, I think currently we're seeing people starting to compete to try to take on that narrative and take on that role. I see Pete Buttigieg and AOC as two examples of people who are getting lots of media appearances in, who
Yeah.
are working really hard to help shape what their view is.
Mhm.
And Waltz is a good example too. Harris is a good example too. I think we're seeing a bunch of people trying to get in and start trying to see how they can become the leader of that. But I think there's still a lot of work to do in order to see someone become, that messenger and that person. I think that might come around to seeing what happens next year. I think AOC is tapping into a lot of people who are currently very frustrated with seeing Democratic incumbents that they see as like, frankly, pretty useless.
Yeah.
They're not standing up in ways that people want to see. And people are seeing AOC pushing towards that, and they like that a lot. But then, Pete Buttigieg is going on a lot of different media appearances and, explaining his viewpoints very well. And I think he's making a lot of really great arguments that people resonate with right now.
Yeah.
And then, I know that Waltz has been going on that national tour too. Harris might end up running for another office, can help elevate her, so I don't think that there is a good example of a leader right now because I think that we're going to have to see how that comes out for maybe the next year and a half. And then we'll hopefully have a more clear idea going into 2028 from that standpoint.
Yeah, I've seen. It's funny that you were talking about like Pete Buttigieg like making those media appearances because you're very right. The past couple of days, and the reason why I even brought him up in the first place was because like I saw he was on Jon Stewart's podcast, and then he was just on Andrew Schultz's podcast like 2 days ago,
Mm-hmm.
like had that long form debate and long form or not debate, but like conversation. And you saw like Andrew Schultz like a Trump supporter, somebody that had Trump on his show, agreed with him, said that he voted for him. You had like Pete Buttigieg go there and like seemingly it felt like change his mind and show like, it with the right kind of messaging, you can get to people like the Andrew Schultz who just seemingly want to hear because like it was very interesting like, listening to the podcast because if you heard the conversation with Andrew Schultz, they were talking about like messaging and like how to best like what best resonates with people. And Andrew Schultz was like, lie to me. Like, I want to hear those lies. I want to be given hope. And it was fascinating, like hearing him say that, saying like, I want to hear lies. I want to hear like reasons to be hopeful, but it's okay if you lie to me because like I felt like that was one of the big issues why we've always had issues with politicians in the first place was because they're constantly lying. Whereas like you're hearing people like Andrew Schultz and the people around him saying like no, like lie to us. We want to hear more of that. So I just thought that was very fascinating to me hearing like that kind of demographic saying like we're okay with lies as long as it gives us hope.
Yeah, I think it comes down to like being an effective communicator. Maybe people don't even maybe they're saying they want lies because they're not able to clearly quite say what they want, but they at least want to have some sort of clear story and clear understanding of what is going on.
Yeah.
And I think going back to Biden, I think that one of his biggest problems is that he was never able to very clearly, and he and his team were never able to clearly kind of tell a story about like what is their administration doing, what is kind of like the long-term goal of this, what is the through line of this.
Yeah.
So I think that people just want to understand what their leaders are trying to do as like a plan. They want to be able to clearly say this person says they're doing this and this and this. Whether that's true or not, that's another thing. But at least having a story about what you're doing is incredibly important, especially in our line of work.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that my issue with Biden when in that first debate where he kind of stumbled over his words and everything, he was too heavy on the statistics and like when it comes to someone like Donald Trump who doesn't reference any stats because I mean realistically the stats and the economic data and all of that is not on his side. When it comes to like debating someone like Donald Trump, you can't go with the big stats. You have to go with those taglines. Like Donald Trump talked about building a wall. He never spoke about how he would build the wall, what he would do in order to build the wall, or how he would reform immigration, which is also a topic we could talk about today because I'm sure you've seen the news. In regards to immigration, I mean, we're seeing even asylum seekers suddenly getting deported without getting due process or a court date. So that's been insane. But it's just been fascinating to see it was fascinating to watch like Biden try to give like stats on like some of the things that he had gotten accomplished, and then Trump just rally over him with like nothing substantive, but like using words that you wouldn't you wouldn't expect like the president like big and beautiful. It was never anything like articulate. And I think that was my issue with Joe Biden and how he kind of conveyed that message because he wasn't doing a great job of, because he was so old and he wasn't able to get like those coherent sentences out. He wasn't giving like that pure economic data or lining it out and being able to rationally explain the economic data, even though he had the stats on his side. So, but I am very hopeful come this midterm because I think that these past couple months with Donald Trump and ramming through these executive orders and not having like anything meaningful really passed within the past couple months that hasn't been turned over by a judge, that Democrats are going to have a better chance come the midterms. But I did want to talk to you about that. John Ossoff's seat is up for re-election come 2026. He is the senator of Georgia. What are your thoughts? Who do you think is the Republican nominee? Do you think it's Marjorie Taylor Greene, or do you think it's a Brian Kemp, or do you think that if somebody else comes out of the woodworks and throws their hat in the ring? And I mean, what do you see his odds of winning the race? If you were to look at it today, what do you see his odds of winning the race be?
I think Ossoff's chances are ranging from good to great. And it just kind of depends on a couple different conditions. The first is whether or not Brian Kemp runs. That's kind of the biggest question.
Yeah.
He would be by and far away the best Republican nominee to go up against Ossoff. I think people are quick to assume that he is going to do it. And I'm not saying that Brian Kemp won't run for the Senate, but I think his chance of doing so is a lot more complicated than people give it credit for. The bottom line is that we are going to have a Democratic midterm. It's going to be a strong Democratic midterm. It's going to be a backlash, just like every midterm usually is. And then when you have a purple state like Georgia, and then you add in the Democratic backlash, even with a great candidate like Brian Kemp, you're kind of fighting against a lot of different odds there.
Mm-hmm.
And, just taking Kemp's, position for a second. If Brian Kemp's goal is to be president one day, going out and then losing against Ossoff in a pro-democratic midterm in an environment that he has no control over, that's not going to be good for his aspirations to be president one day, right?
Yeah.
Especially since Donald Trump has made it clear that he does not necessarily see JD Vance as his successor.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's definitely explicitly said many times that he is not willing to anoint JD Vance as his successor.
Yeah.
You think about like Brian Kemp. I'm one of the most popular governors in America, with in terms of his approval rating. He has this conservative track record of success from like a Republican standpoint. If you don't even really want to be United States senator because you think of it as like a stepping stone to being president, why do you take all that risk, campaign in this huge brutal race, and then if you want to run for president 2 years after, like unless his plan is, and also unless his plan is to wait much longer and then run for president in the next decade. But when we're talking about running in the next decade, I mean, think about who people used to think would be presidential candidates. Chris Christie, Marco Rubio, Scott Walker.
Yeah.
Those people fell off hard because they missed their chance, right? So, with Kemp, I don't think it's a granted that he's going to run for Senate. And if I was him and if his goal is to become president, I would almost probably not do it.
Yeah.
Which is to say that if Brian Kemp runs against Jon Ossoff, it's going to be a pretty good toss-up. People will point to the fact that Kemp's polls against Ossoff show Kemp winning right now, but that's always the case when you have a popular governor coming off of their administration to run against an incumbent senator.
Mm-hmm.
And those polls always fade back a little bit. We saw that with Phil Bredesen running as a Democrat for Tennessee Senate.
Yeah.
We saw that, with Steve Bullock running for Senate in Montana as a outgoing popular governor. There's always going to be some clawback when it's a real race instead of a hypothetical. So I don't think you can take it for granted that Kemp is going to win just because he's shown being a few points up from Ossoff right now. Again, especially like you pointed out earlier, it's been 100 days. We're already exhausted of all this stuff. People are already really concerned. Does Brian Kemp want to be running against Jon Ossoff a year and a half from now, thinking about all the crazy stuff that's going to happen between now and then? I don't know if he wants to do that. So then that hits to the second part of this conditional, which is who runs then. And there are currently about 4 major elected officials in Georgia who have explicitly said something to the effect of, if Brian Kemp does not run, I'm going to run. They've literally said that to the AJC or 2 different news media outlets.
Yeah.
And all of them are definitely on like a weaker tier compared to Kemp because they don't have that name recognition as resources. So if Ossoff has to face one of them, he definitely has a slightly better chance. And some of those people are Rich McCormick, the congressman for the North Metro Atlanta area, like Forsyth County or Fulton.
Yeah.
I know Buddy Carter, the congressman for the coast of Georgia, has looked at it. I know Mike Collins for Athens and Northeast Georgia made one of those statements to be pretty clear that if Kemp doesn't run, he's going to run. You have John King, the Insurance and Labor Commissioner of Georgia.
Yeah.
So you have these people, and Marjorie Taylor Greene has not made a statement indicating that she would run as clearly as those other guys I just listed.
Yeah.
Like those other 4 guys literally have said something to the effect of, if Kemp does not run, I will do it, or I will heavily consider doing it.
Yeah.
I don't believe that Marjorie Taylor Greene has said something so definitive. And I think that she would struggle to beat all those candidates collectively, especially, depending on Donald Trump's endorsement too. But I think because she would be such a weak candidate, even far weaker than all those other people against Ossoff, I think that there'd be a lot of effort from Georgia Republicans to try to pull some strings to at least try to make sure that Trump stays out of it for that. I think that enough of them have enough sway to keep that from happening.
Yeah.
Because if Marjorie Taylor Greene is the nominee against Ossoff, that is one of the weakest candidates that they could possibly put forward, and I would feel really good in Ossoff's position at that point.
Couldn't you say the same thing about Herschel Walker, though? I mean, Herschel Walker seemed like a terrible option, but he ended up winning the primaries and then ultimately going up as the Republican nominee.
Well, that was because Trump endorsed him over the other candidates. And also the candidates that Herschel Walker was facing were of a much lower profile collectively than the people I just mentioned. The people I just mentioned, you have 2 or 3 members of Congress. You have a current statewide elected official, not to mention anyone else. Herschel Walker faced off against the Agriculture Commissioner of Georgia. That was the strongest person he faced. Everyone else that he faced was a bunch of random people who had never held elected office before or had, but it was like over 10 years prior to that race. Like that's just an entirely different caliber difference in the field versus Herschel Walker versus the field versus Marjorie Taylor Greene, hypothetically.
Yeah. So speaking of Brian Kemp kind of rolling off as governor, who do you think the Democrats put up as their nominee uh, for governor, or who do you think is most likely to win the governorship from the Democratic Party? Do you think
That's
Stacey
a huge.
Abrams is running it for a third time too?
She is.
I said, do you? I said, do you think Stacey Abrams is
Oh,
for a third time?
I don't think she's going to do it a third time. I think that she, you know, give it her best for two races. It'd be really unusual for someone to want to do that three times in a row.
Mm,
In terms of just how brutal it is and how much of a huge commitment it is to run for something like that so
right.
many times. And she also just has a lot of other things that are very successful in terms of like her speaking tour and her books and like the different like organization things she's involved with and advocacy groups that I don't know if she wants to do that again. And Lucy McBath was going to look like a really great candidate, but she had to pull away, as we know. And that kind of leaves the field open. So I know you have, former mayor of Atlanta, Keisha Lance Bottoms, who I do not think would be a very strong candidate because her approval rating as mayor was not great.
Yeah.
And also her work with the Biden administration kind of makes it easier to tie her to that sort of stuff. Nothing against her personally, but that resume just doesn't, that's not a great starting point. Um, you have Jason Estevez, the state senator, who I'm a huge fan of.
Mhm.
I know him personally because I am the chief of staff for a different state senator, and I got to Senator Nikki Merritt outside of our business, and I got to know Senator Estevez pretty well because they share an office this past session.
Mhm.
I think he's crazy smart. He's really wonderful at presenting his arguments and talking about why he's doing what he's doing, and he also has a huge range of experience that he's going to be bringing in to the race. Not a lot of people know, but he was the chair of the Atlanta Public School Board prior to being elected state senator.
Yeah.
And there's so many issues coming up with education in our state. That's really one of the hottest button issues that's been kind of sitting there that has not been addressed. And he's certainly in a position where he can talk about that. He has a really compelling personal story. He's a lot younger than a lot of candidates we see. Um, and his main barrier is that, as a relatively young state senator, he does not have very high name recognition.
Right.
But because he's running so early, he's going to have a lot of time to address that and work on that. So I would, I'm definitely going to, I'll be personally voting for, Jason Estevez, next year. He also has a lot of great ideas about how to support Democrats running down ballot for state house and state senate because he knows that in order to run a successful state government, you have to be able to have everyone on the same footing, to be able to support the down ballot. Um, so I really hope that he's a nominee because I think he'd do a great job, even though a lot of people don't know who he is right now.
Yeah.
But, you know, outside of, that, I know there's a few other candidates looking at like Mike Thurman, the former DeKalb County CEO and labor commissioner.
Yeah.
Um, you know, and there's maybe a few other candidates you could see getting in, but it's
Lucy
basically
McBeth.
all who else?
Lucy McBeth. She launched an exploratory, and
She
then
had to she drew back of that because her husband is dealing with a serious health issue. So
yeah.
I don't think she's going to be running.
Okay.
Um,
Do you think she stays in Congress though?
maybe. I understand. I don't know for sure, but I think her husband was diagnosed with a very serious illness. So I don't know how that's going to impact her plans. Um, but basically, I think that at this point you have a bunch of people who are not going to be as well known
Mhm.
because Jason Carter also is not doing it because his wife is currently battling cancer. So I mean that really kind of leaves out a lot of the more well-known people,
Right.
which I'm excited about because we need a bench in Georgia. We need to be running more people than the same 3 to 4 people for everything.
Yeah.
So I'm really hopeful that we can see some great candidates coming through for these offices and see what they can do. And I feel really optimistic about Jason Estevez being able to be a great person for that.
Yeah. I think he's my state senator, if I'm not mistaken. I'm in East Cobb. He was at least a couple years ago.
So he did represent a lot of East Cobb, but his district was kind of redrawn. He represents like East Atlanta going down into portions of like the south suburbs, but also like Marietta.
I'm in Marietta. I
Well,
live.
not like this, like the city proper.
Oh, city proper. Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha. Because I was about to say I live down do you know where like Atlanta Country Club is?
Yes.
I live around there.
He used to represent that area back when it was he had succeeded Jen Jordan, but with the new
Yes.
district because he lives in Atlanta, so the most of the district is in Fulton, but it does go into like the city of Marietta itself.
Gotcha.
That's his new district. So he has Cobb and Fulton visibility for sure. And he's also from Columbus, so
Mhm.
that's kind of helpful too. He has that background.
Right.
But we'll see how he's able to use his resources and kind of convert that to increase his name recognition between now and next year.
Yeah, because if I'm not mistaken, he ran against Louisa Wakeman a couple of years ago.
Yes,
Yeah, and
that's how he originally ended up in that state senate seat to begin with.
right. Yeah, because I was about to say when Louisa Wakeman was running, I remember because she ended up going against Sharon Cooper for the first two races, lost against her both times, and then they gerrymandered her out of. Well, I think she still was eligible to run against Sharon Cooper, but she opted into going against Jason Estevez and going for a Senate seat, and then as you know, ended up losing because of Jason Estevez. And I did vote for Jason Estevez uh, uh, our representative. But yeah, that's actually really exciting. I did not know that he was considering running. He had even mentioned that he was going to run.
He's announced.
Oh, he has.
He put out a commercial like 2 days ago,
Oh,
like
that's
a
awesome.
intro video. Yeah, go check it out.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to do that. That's really awesome. Yeah, so I mean, in terms of other state races, though, like do you see Georgia becoming more turning a little more purple this upcoming election cycle, or do you think that we're going to stay around the same of like we're going to get our standard races? You might see a couple things turn red because like I feel like there has been a lot of pushback to Donald Trump in these first 100 days, and it just I feel like there's been a lot of frustration towards him too, and I don't know if that's just noise again. But I mean, I also believe that this time around it is a little different because like I don't know, even friends that I know who voted for Donald Trump are starting to regret their vote and saying like, they're just like, man, like this is with these tariffs, prices are about to go up. They've been personally impacted in some capacity, and so like I feel like there's been some kind of shift. But do you think that we're going to actually gain some seats this time around, or where's your head at with this upcoming race?
Yeah, I think we're in the General Assembly for Georgia. We're going to gain some seats. Um, because there's some easy, really close state house races to begin with that we can get.
Mm-hmm.
And the name of the game is that what we're shooting for as Democrats in Georgia is to have a fair seat at the table for redistricting in 20 after the 2030 census.
Okay.
Because that's how we're going to get maps that are competitive for us to be able to eventually control the whole state. Because, for example, right now, the state Senate, we can get maybe another seat or two there, but the state Senate map is such that where it is not realistic. I think we're going to flip the state Senate in Georgia
Mm-hmm.
prior to the end of this decade, right? So our choices then are to control the governor's seat or to flip the state house, which are both feasible. And I think that the pro-democratic surge in energy we can see next year will
Mm-hmm.
hopefully be help us advance to that. We need 11 more seats in the state house. I would say there's probably about 5 or 6 that are like really clear, very feasible for us to get in the immediate future.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are many opportunities that are developable if we continue working. So what I would like to see us do is to win another state Senate seat next year and to also flip maybe, 4 to 6 state house seats, because that will allow us to continue progressing and eventually control the state house, regardless of what happens with the governor's race. I think that we have a good chance of the governor's race with it being an open seat. But one thing we run up against, and this is another political science thing in America, is that people's voting behavior changes from the top of the ballot to the bottom. And what I mean by that is that people are more likely to start voting for a different party for president and U.S. Senate and U.S. House first, because it's easier for them to still remain connected to the brand of their party at home. Like there are lots of people who will not vote for Donald Trump or did not vote for Herschel Walker for a variety of reasons, but they're still happy with how the state is being run. So they voted for Brian Kemp and they voted for the Republican for state Senate and state House because that is different and more localized to them. than, Herschel Walker or Donald Trump is. And part of our battle here as Democrats in Georgia is continuing to work to convince people that, hey, maybe your state senator or your state house rep acts more normally or acts more conventionally compared to what you expect a politician to be like, but his values are exactly the same and he supports exactly the same things as Donald Trump does. And helping people make that connection so that their behavior can continue to change. Because we've gotten them to vote for Warnock, we've gotten them to vote for Ossoff, we got them to vote for Biden, but we're still trying to fight that fight of getting people to change their voting behavior for local and state office. So that is a challenge we face. And for now, I think flipping our state government is going to be a difficult proposition, but it's about getting a seat at the table so that we can continue to make progress.
Yeah. Um, as of right now, like if let's hypothetically say the midterms were tomorrow, what exactly would your messaging be? Would you focus more on immigration? Would you focus more on the tariffs? I mean, what would be your main focus on saying like, hey, like you must be unhappy with what's happening right now. Um, Democrats offer a better option here, here, and here. Like what would your messaging be if you were to if the election was tomorrow?
So on a state level, if I'm talking about state offices, like where we exist,
Yeah.
you know, I'm thinking more about the economy and I'm still thinking about people's civil rights. Because I think that a lot of people also definitely have not taken as seriously, the ability for us to see backslides in people's civil rights, whether that's like the LGBTQ community or, like our rights to choose our reproductive freedom. There are things like that that are now under more existential threat than maybe people considered before.
Mhm.
So I would like to hit those issues and I want to hit the economy. Stability at the end of the day is what people need in the economy. You know, people maybe had issues with how the economy was under Biden's administration, but especially with seeing how the stock market has gone, seeing what people's concerns are about pricing, I know for my part, I would rather take a situation that's not great, but at least predictable, so I can get myself out of that situation, than deal with something where I have no idea what's going to happen the next day when I'm trying to plan my own personal finances and my own economic future next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now as a small business owner.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up the stock market. I was telling Chase about this the other day. So the S&P 500's performance since inauguration day is now the worst for any president up to this point in data going back to 1928. I know that there were a lot of people, that were probably planning to retire this year who are having to rethink because their 401k or the Roth IRA was completely decimated by um, the the past couple months worth of action from Donald Trump. Um, in terms of like these tariffs, where are we with this, or where do you think we're headed with this? Do you think that we're going to get some kind of negotiation done with China anytime soon, or do you think that this is going to drag out? Because it seems like China doesn't want to come to the table, and I know we wanted to focus mainly on state politics, but I do want to hear maybe your perspective on this because you were talking about the economy. Like, where are we in terms of negotiation? Do you think that China comes to the table, or do you think that Donald Trump is just beating his chest right now, saying like I've gotten deals with a couple of countries, still working things out, and is going to try to present that as a win because like I don't think that anything is moving with China.
I imagine there's going to be some sort of deal worked out, but it almost doesn't matter because that deal is going to involve some form of tariffing, and that's going to be worse than what the status quo was before. We're still going to, no matter what the deal is, it's still going to end up leading to higher costs, than what we were doing under trade policy prior to this point. And, the other thing too is like, I think that this whole process has shown how erratic things can be under this administration with the economy. Even if they do work out a deal, if I'm planning a business from a logistics standpoint, do I have a high degree of faith that things will still be the same next month? I mean, not really.
Yeah.
So I don't know if working out a deal is still going to see some increase in pricing, but B, I don't think that working out a deal is going to leave the marketplace or any of these longer term planning actors in these businesses from, I don't think they're going to be feeling more confident after, a so-called deal is struck than they are right now because it could change at any given point with the administration.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to hear your perspective on that because this is they say unprecedented times, and I think that it was the CEO of J.P. Morgan, it was one of the financial banks, said that there was a 60% chance of a recession happening this year now. And even with this 90-day pause, and I mean, we did see a pause when Donald Trump initially announced tariffs against Canada and Mexico. Um, we saw, Donald Trump put a 30-day pause and then things kind of balanced back out. And then, as soon as that 30 days was over, tariffs were reinstituted. And now we're in the middle of what the impact was from Liberation Day, if we're really still calling it Liberation Day. But, but the I am kind of curious to see what happens after this 90-day pause is up because this Liberation Day was literally only like less than 3 weeks ago. So I don't know what exactly is going to happen these next couple of months. There's a lot of uncertainty. You've seen the stock market. Stock market does not like uncertainty. They like commitments. They like to know what's going to happen in the future. They like to know that the Federal Reserve is going to be cutting interest rates. They like to know that Jerome Powell is the head of the Federal Reserve is safe, and Donald Trump's remarks on Monday seemingly it seemed like he was going to fire Jerome Powell and then started to walk that back after people started really questioning like the Fed's independence and where we were in terms of inflation, how he was able to combat that. Even though, which is wild, it's wild to me to think that Donald Trump was the one that appointed him the head of the Federal Reserve.
Right.
Now all of a sudden he's going back, but I mean that's not too far from the course because I mean almost every single cabinet member from his 2016 administration has no interest in being involved with him in any capacity now. I mean, we've seen he totally cleaned house and has totally new staff. But yeah, it's very fascinating to see what's been happening with the stock market, and wanted to hear your thoughts. Chase, you have any questions? I know you're sitting quietly waiting for the past 52 minutes, it seems like. So, any questions?
I mean, I think it was, I was very interested in what Alex was saying and kind of like his experience and things like that. And, I would say I'm just on the statewide candidates race. Is it, I do think Estevez had probably one of the best launches. I mean, not that there's been, many launches, but I think just seeing a little bit of the traction and the messaging, it was a very strong ad, I think. And then, I'm very interested in, you know, continuing the trend of the purple district. And I think, a lot of the messaging that we're talking about and stuff like that, I think is really kind of right where we need to go, really. Because there's just not, there is, people are going to react the same way, I think, to, you know, Donald Trump in a bad economy as they did to Joe Biden in a bad economy. There's not going to be this overwhelming, like, oh, he's great or anything like that. Like, at the end of the day, people are going to feel the same way because, you know, if there's no tangible results in my life getting better, it doesn't matter who the president is. And I think, just kind of conveying as statewide candidates and things like that, the things you can actually do for people to get some tangible results for them. So yeah, I mean, I think really just what he was talking about was great.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I think that we're seeing like a newer generation of people starting to take leadership roles in the Democratic Party of Georgia.
Mhm.
And that gives me a lot of hope that we're going to see a lot more progress because there's a lot of people who like their political origin stories like mine, where it's more informed by the rise of Donald Trump than what happened before. And I feel like those experiences are going to be valuable in this era trying to contest these elections with that new perspective. For example, the new executive director of the Georgia Senate Democrats, Nick Savas, he is coming in. He has a lot of energy. He's a lot of excitement to want to fight stuff. He is someone that I would think that people should be watching to see what happens in terms of being able to flip some of these seats. And he, a lot of his political origin stories like mine, where he was first getting involved with stuff in Georgia around that time period, and now he holds an extremely important leadership position in the state, just like that. So I think that, seeing new candidates hold our statewide nominations for different offices, like governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, we're going to see a lot of younger candidates and a lot of people whose political story started after 2016 taking leadership positions. I think it's going to be interesting to see how that changes the dynamic of what we're doing. Because even though Stacey Abrams certainly came to prominence during Donald Trump's presidency, her political story starts long before that. Jason Carter's obviously started long before that. Um, so we're going to continue to see more and more people in the state level stepping up. And I think it's going to be really exciting to then see what those people can bring to the table.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Alex, is there anything else that you want to add on? Any shout outs you want to give? Anything that you thought that we didn't touch on that you wanted to bring up before we ended here?
Yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit about local races. There's something that not a lot of people know, especially younger folks like us, is that in Georgia, every single city, except for like four of them, has their elections for mayor and city council in odd numbered years. And the only exceptions to what I just said are like Macon, Athens, Columbus, and then one or two other ones. But like Atlanta's mayoral races this year.
Mhm.
And virtually every city is having their municipal elections. And that's actually how Mo, my spouse, and I make our living in odd numbered years. These races are becoming more and more competitive. Um, and we're seeing people spending the amount to run for city council in a lot of these cities in the Atlanta area that you would spend to run for state house, or spending the amount of money to become mayor of some of these cities that you would spend to run for state senate. There are being hotly competitive races that are being paid a lot more attention to than they were 10 years ago. And these races are impacting some of the most important things of people our age in terms of, the cost of housing. All these cities they tend to have really regressive policies when it comes to zoning and construction. And that is directly impacting people's ability to live in these areas. So, especially if you live in North Fulton, where I live, especially if you live in Cobb County or Gwinnett County or DeKalb County, you need to look and see what cities are having elections near you and who's up for them. Because another thing that, like when I was talking earlier about the down ballot lag effect, that's even stronger further down the ballot you go. While there are still Republican state House members and state senators representing areas that are purple, there are some very blue cities that still have conservative people running the cities from like the mayoral and council standpoint. And that needs to change if we want to be able to have housing that's affordable, or have transit that works for us, or have infrastructure that has younger people in mind. And that is all happening this year. And if you want to get involved in politics, it is a perfect opportunity to be given a lot of responsibility on these campaigns that just really need help. To put it in perspective, I live in Roswell. In our last municipal election, in 2023, we broke the turnout record for a non-mayoral year, and that was 19% of registered voters. Our record for a mayoral year, which is this year in 2021, is 22% of registered voters. And I'll add one more stat that's insane. In 2023, with that Roswell municipal election, less than 5% of the voters who showed up were under the age of 30. And the median voter age in the election was 59 years old.
Wow.
Those people are unfortunately not going to be advancing policies that are good for people like me or like you guys who are in our late 20s and 30s. So I really want people, especially people our age, to look at cities and get involved with that. Even if you don't live in the city, there are lots of people who live in unincorporated areas near cities, and what that city does still impacts the area completely surrounding the city in terms of again, the zoning policies, the business development policies. So it is just of vital importance that we see better turnout, especially from younger people, and more involvement in these municipal elections.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I 100% agree. I think that a lot of people don't realize how important these municipalities really are, because like that day to day is very impactful. And there definitely is a big difference that it makes, especially when it comes to zoning and building new things. And I mean, I think state senate or the House voted a couple of years ago on like expanding MARTA. I think it was to. Do you remember that? It was like they had an intention to expand MARTA from like from North Springs all the way to if I'm not mistaken, it was like Alpharetta, and they voted against that because they were like, oh, it's going to bring the wrong people here, even though MARTA goes through Sandy Springs and Dunwoody, and this is still a very safe area. Um, and I thought that would have been like a huge difference maker and would have helped a lot with congestion, especially with Atlanta traffic. I mean, Atlanta traffic is hands down the worst traffic in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And the part of the reason why we have this problem is that they also tried to have referendums in Cobb and Gwinnett to expand MARTA. And in those cases, those types of things failed narrowly. In fact, the last Gwinnett expansion for MARTA referendum that they had, it failed by like 3 or 4%. Um, and you know, and so we're talking about the county and these cities are presenting pretty large barriers to expanding MARTA, to expanding even bus service from MARTA.
Yeah.
And if you want any of this stuff to change, that's where it has to start. And if we want great candidates running for state house and state senate, I always say there's no better candidates than someone who's done it before. And if we get more good younger folks elected to city council seats, those people will then be able to run and flip some state house and state senate seats. And that's where we really need to be in the long term. So that's, I don't need to shout out anybody, but I just want to shout out participating in those elections this year. All this is happening this year, and I can't underscore that enough.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it, Alex. This was very insightful. Excited to see what you guys have going forward this year. But thank you so much for your time here.
Absolutely. Thank you both for having me. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate it.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Chase.
Thanks, Alex.
See ya. Thanks.